Hello everybody, so my name is Alina Mungiu-Pippidi and I'm very happy to greet everyone who is watching this video, live or otherwise. Greetings from Berlin to this second tutorial. The way this tutorial and the next are conceived is that using the tools that I have showed in the previous tutorial, but now entering in a logic which is no longer the logic of means, but the logic of ends, a logic of what we want to achieve, I am going to review a little bit the kind of strategies that successful countries have tried to cut opportunities for corruption or reduce resources for corruption, and this is what we do in this particular material, and to increase constraints for corruption, and this is what we do next time. So first, let me say that we have, as we discussed in the first session, always two kinds of situations. In other words, there is a situation when the person who is in charge really wants to fight corruption, and then it's a situation where a number of tools apply. And then there is the other situation where in fact the people who are in charge, the government, or the people who have the real power in the country, because it sometimes happens that the government doesn't really have the power. There are various vested interest groups who tend to be very, very powerful. Well, these people in fact may not want to change the situation. And there is a completely different story. And we need to be aware of this at all times, because we should not propose to situations where in fact people in charge do not want to change corruption, solutions from when in fact they are the #1 champions and they are out there, right? So we start with this very, very basic minimal principle. We have to take it for self-evident that any government, either it's popularly elected or not, in fact can do something against corruption if they want. If they don't know what to do, which I find, to be honest, rather implausible, here is where we give them some advice. Otherwise, we keep, in mind at all times that we are probably under the second situation, where there's not, in fact, so much will to change control of corruption. So let me return to our equilibrium model then. So how does in general look a society where corruption is well controlled? Well, this society simply has sufficient power to moderate a reasonable number of resources for corruption which exist, so that in every moment the rulers feel constrained by the society, so they cannot spoil resources to their own benefit and to their groups, right? And you remember that we discussed that it acts like a balance. It acts like a balance where in fact the balance can be stuck in various positions, so it's not necessarily a good balance where constraints outweigh resources. It can be the other way around, or it can be stuck in quite a number of other equilibria, which we call suboptimal equilibria. And on the side of resources, we discussed that literature, researchers, historians also have shown that power discretion and material resources both are quite important in producing corruption. Now, what are the most important factors which have come out in research to produce corruption? I will go through them fast because we need to discuss them in order to understand what can be done about them. The traditional and most important factor that you've all heard about among the material resources for corruption are basically natural resources. The more natural resources a country has, the more corruption it has. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is simply that natural resources are a concentrated rent, something which exists and it's very tempting to exploit. Natural resources are also associated with violence. If you have a diamond mine, there's very likely that a lot of people will compete in order to have this diamond mine, and it's not going to be, elections and distribution of proceeds according to some algorithm which treats everybody fairly and equally. But it's not only that, you know, I mean, money from natural resources can serve people who are in government not only to spoil a lot, but also to buy the votes that they need, for instance, right? So in other words, they offer a fantastic resource for corruption in innumerable ways. And therefore, countries which have such resources do not get rich. What they do is that they tend to have instability, violence, and considerable corruption. Now, what is important is that there are two outliers to this. And it's quite important to understand why these outliers exist. The traditional outlier is Botswana, a landlocked country in Africa, which has, you know, in a continent where mineral resources have been the recipe for disaster, Botswana, which has diamonds, that's their natural resource, has managed to control this very well. Now, what did they do? What did they do is that they left these diamond mines to be managed by a private company. Botswana, like many other countries, has natural resources constitutionally in the property of the whole country. It's a national property, but the management has always been to this South African company called Botswana. And the proceeds have always been divided 50% between the Botswana government and 50% between this company. Now, this is the only successful example in the developing world that we have, right? It may, you know, people may think of 10,000 better formulas, but I do not like to show you solutions which are theoretically good. I'm showing you this solution because this is the only one which worked. Of course, there are a number of things on the side of Botswana which enabled this successful approach. Well, one thing is that the money which entered Botswana, the 50%, were not appropriated by the rulers of Botswana. And this simply has a different explanation. This comes to the fact that Botswana was basically ruled by its traditional rulers. It's traditional rulers who have modernized themselves and turned into constitutional rulers, right? This is the first president of Botswana. And this is something which apparently is changing now. Botswana is not doing as well as they used to. But this is a successful model, right? It's not an easy model to reproduce because you have to start by having, again, this enlightened ruler, who's not a despot, but who's an enlightened ruler that Botswana had. But the simple model, the model of giving management to a private company which has interest to do profit, but in the same time put it equitably, the proceeds at 50%, it's really a reasonable model out of imperfect solutions which exist out there. The second, of course, fantastic paradox is Norway. Norway has this extraordinary revenues from oil in the North Sea, and nevertheless, Norway is on top of all good governance charts. Now, why don't resources hinder Norway's good governance? Well, the answer to that is a historical answer. It's basically the good governance of Norway, the equilibrium of Norway, the balance was fixed before they found these resources. And therefore, again, it's not something which is easy to copy. You cannot tell people, you know, first fix your governance and then you can afford to find oil, because people already have oil or diamonds or whatever. But these are the only two historical examples that we have. The second very important material resource for corruption is the informal economy of a country. Informal economy and corruption go hand in hand. And of course, you know, they feed one another. It's not just one feeds the other and not reciprocal. But still, it is easier to tackle informal economy than corruption. And this is why informal economy should be seen as an underground economy in any way, as a resource for corruption. Why is that? I mean, I will only name two important reasons. One is that you have an unaccountable flow of money out there. Quite a lot of money that nobody knows it exists. This money doesn't go to transparent bank accounts, doesn't go through companies' accounts, and therefore anything can happen with this money. So it is in the best interest and an important anti-corruption strategy of any country that this flow of unaccountable money goes down, is less, right? You have to try to put most transactions into the transparent side by credit cards, electronic payments, or any other forms that you can think of. The second important resource for corruption from informal economy comes from all the people who work without having a contract. Now, all these people with work without having a contract actually means a population which will need a public service sooner or later. You know, poor countries don't have such a variety of private services. They do offer some private services. But you know, there are, you know, areas where you cannot avoid the government. People may need a copy of their identity paper, right? People may need to marry one day, they need to divorce, they may need to do things. You know, there are opportunities where you may need to put gas into your stove, right? So there are opportunities where the state reaches you in the end and finds you, and then you will have to have some papers, right? And if you don't work anywhere, you won't probably be able to do any of these things, and then what are you going to do? You are going to have to bribe. So in other words, having millions of people out there who need access to various services that only the state can offer without any sort of legal proof that they exist and they have some income means simply multiplying the opportunities of corruption by million. So in one way or another, we have to find ways again of bringing these people to the surface. Maybe you have seen in the news these days the terrible example of Peru, a country which is really fighting corruption or has been fighting corruption in the past 2 years. They are very, very constrained by coronavirus these days, so they have quite a bad situation. And their public hospitals asked people to bring their oxygen tubes from home. So in other words, if you have a relative who goes into intensive therapy in Peru these days, you have to find on the black market an oxygen tube, buy it and present with it to the public hospital. Now, why does this happen? Well, it happens because in Peru, 70% of the workforce are informally employed. So nobody really pays for these public hospitals. Less than 30% of the workforce pays for them, but they have to accept in situations like this everybody, because epidemics is exactly a situation where you cannot only treat people who subscribe to the health system. For obvious reasons, you have to treat everybody, right? Because everybody can contaminate everybody. But then where do you get the resources for this? The second impressive thing about Peru is that by trying to fight corruption, they really managed to block their procurement system. A few years ago, a report from IMF, for instance, found that over 90% of their attempt to buy something, to offer public contracts, actually had to be cancelled, and they had to restart the whole procedure. Right? First, because they were corrupt, and second, because they tried to solve corruption, but in a very, very mistaken way. So in other words, it's impossible for these poor Peru hospitals to go out and do a very effective procurement contract and get some oxygen tubes. They don't have the money, and they do not have the effectiveness, right, to buy things like this. So there are successful examples. Other countries have tackled this successfully. Now, the country which has tackled it the best in Latin America is Uruguay, who unfortunately, for some very, very strange reasons, is insufficiently studied by people. So Uruguay, for instance, have managed to have this very small tax. It's called monotax. Other countries have attempted it as well, but it didn't work. They didn't do it well enough, in which people pay only a very small amount, and this very small amount serves for any kind of payments that you need in order to deal with the state, for unemployment, for health, for social security, for anything that you need, even if it's insufficient. Why? Because if you know that you have an incentive, if you know that you are going to get health, then you will pay something. The second smart thing that Uruguay has done is that they commission the private sector to collect taxes. So in other words, when people receive remittances for, relatives who work abroad, and they go, the people who are, let's say, Western Union or another local offices who are just giving their money, they also have a commission from the government if tax is collected. So they would tell that person, look, your son has sent you $100. Why don't you put $3 on your monotax? In this way, if you have a problem, you can go to the hospital. It is simply excess, even if you don't pay enough, right? You don't pay enough individually, but by attracting so many people into the formal world, you manage to get more money for the government, and in the end of the day, to ensure that more people have access. So monotax, a solution which should have been implemented for years and it was not. Offsourcing to the private sector, giving commissions to everybody to use credit card, to divert a part of the payment that somebody gives in the private sector at supermarket for taxes against the commission that government pays you. Quite a number of solutions exist. Uruguay, best example, soft solutions, not crackdowns on informal economy, because it's quite impossible in a country where nearly everybody, right, 7 people out of 10 work in the informal economy. It's impossible to have a crackdown. What are you going to do? You know, you're going to destroy your economy if you go against all these companies. What you have to do is to create incentives for companies and incentives for individuals and their families, so that people more and more come into the open. And in this way, you dry the resources for corruption, or these resources for corruption which exist due to the underground economy. Number 3, material resource, is one which is more difficult to change, but I have to mention it, right? And it is what is called in political theory multiculturalism. Multiculturalism doesn't mean people of several cultures mixing in a community, but means something very specific in political theory, means a nation which is divided on ethnic lines. In other words, people do not participate to the nation as individuals, but they participate to the nations as groups. Groups are structurally internal politically, right? And, you know, we have very famous examples like Lebanon or Bosnia. These are the kind of groups and constitutions, which multicultural constitutions which exist. The reason they were structured this way was in order to stop very bloody civil wars which took place in these countries. So in the end of the day, in order to stop the civil wars, the country was basically, and the government of the country, the state, was cut across the groups. Unfortunately, this creates a lot of corruption, and you have seen in the protests in Lebanon in the last year that people can at a certain moment really get fed up with it. Now, why is so much corruption associated to this model of government? This model of government definitely is better than having one group dominate the others, right? One group the masters and the other groups the slaves. Nevertheless, it's a very corrupt model, because this structure by groups actually kills any sort of political association. Political associations should be about left or about right, about distributing more, about distributing less. This is what politics is about. Politics should not be that I am white and you are black, I'm a woman and you're a male, and then we have a male party and a female party and we divide everything by 50%. Why not? Because inside these groups, in fact, due to this collectivistic organization, what happens is that you only have a very hierarchical structure, and then groups only fight among themselves to get more spoils from the government, and the overall amount of spoils simply increases because everybody takes whatever they want, and there's no accountability. You know, I cannot fight against the female in chief, because then I will be seen as subversive towards the female group as versus the male group, right? And the other way around. So accountability is very low, competition for resources across this group is very high, and this is why multicultural societies, again multicultural understood as in our theory, as several groups competing for the state as groups, not as individual citizens, this is very detrimental for good control of corruption. And each time when this organization can be avoided, of course without returning to the civil war, it should. Power discretion. Now, how does power discretion create opportunities for corruption? Well, of course, it's obvious. No, I mean, it's obvious. Whoever has power can abuse it, and abuse of power for undue profit is the definition of corruption, right? But it's a bit more complicated than this, and it explains why corruption is such a widespread phenomena, and it's not reduced only to people to give bribes. What happened is that basically regulation is crafted by powerful people in order to control access to opportunities. Let's say I have 3 mines, okay, I will take care that concessions for these 3 mines go to the people who support me, right? One goes to my family, another one goes to this very important group who could challenge me in government, so I need to give them something, right? You know, there are countries where this is how it works. This is how it works. And that means that whoever is not in a position to challenge the rulers, in fact, will be denied these opportunities. Opportunities will only be shared among the most powerful. This combines with the fact that in societies like this, these powerful people are also above the law. Even if they do something wrong, the law would not apply to them, even if in principle and constitutionally you have rule of law. In practice, it doesn't work. So the more you have this disproportion of power, the more people have power resources, the more you will have in a country both legal and illegal corruption. And they have to be understood together, not separately. We should not just think of illegal corruption. We should not just think of petty bribes. Frequently, bribes are the ways of powerless people to open access, because otherwise access is monopolized by the powerful people. How is this work in practice? Well, in practice, in fact, we find in literature that countries which are corrupt have very bad regulatory quality. Why is this? Complicated laws were created to suit powerful people's interests. And since powerful people are not, perhaps similar in the same moment in time, you have this cumbersome, complicated, at times contradictory legislations full of barriers, which will deny access to people without political connections, but would enable people with political connection because to them the law does not apply. So we will actually find poor regulatory quality and very high red tape. Very high red tape, very cumbersome legislation in countries like this. The resource for corruption is very much connected to this red tape, poor regulatory quality, and it's basically secrecy. The more we don't know what a government does, of course, the more government is able to divert resources towards narrow interest versus the general interest. When I mean that secrecy is important, it doesn't mean de jure. I mean secrecy as scripted in a law, but it simply means easy and costless access to all the resources that we need to prevent other people from cheating us. To prevent government from cheating us, but also other people, right? Also other people. If you want to buy a house in the United States, you can go and in a public register, which is digital, you can see it up there. You will see the price for which the house was sold last time. You would see who bought it for the last 2-3 times, and you would see the same for all your neighbors. You will immediately see if it's a scam there or not. Why? Because all this resource is publicly available. Sweden had a land cadastre over 300 years ago. And this is why resources for corruption in this area have gradually diminished. You cannot really give a house as a bribe because everybody would see that this house has been, for instance, very cheap compared to the price of transactions in that area. Now, fiscal transparency, the budget transparency, the resources of the government transparency are also quite important to see. And in fact, it's a long tradition in this as well. Even before the French Revolution, the poor French monarch Louis XVI made the budget publicly available. And this was very costly for him because people noticed how unreasonable expenses, the court and Versailles had. Nevertheless, today, we have all kinds of techniques and organizations who supervise fiscal transparency. But nevertheless, even governments which claim to produce fiscal transparency, they don't really do this very much. The reason being that, if you publish a budget in very complicated old accounting categories and in a PDF, nobody's going to be able to read it. A statistician, someone like one of my bright students who stay here and just look things online, they won't be able to download this budget and look for irregularities because this budget is not in open data, it's an Adobe PDF. So in other words, it's been a big progress for fiscal transparency, monitored by Open Budget Index, but in the same time, it is there are quite a number of obstacles, even for governments which theoretically publish their budget, for simple citizens to be able to see if their school or if their hospital spends more in order to offer the same quality of education or the same quality of health as the one in the next county. Now, all these things are put together in our index for public integrity through very simple proxies. And again, I encourage you to think beyond these proxies. These proxies are the place where you start in order to get an estimation for your country. But you should look in the same area for other equivalent proxies. So time to start a business and pay taxes is our proxy for red tape. Transparency of public expenditures from Open Budget Index, but not all, because Open Budget Index is more about consultation than about transparency, and therefore what we use is just a fraction of 12 questions, which roughly allows people to check the public expenditures of their government. Finally, the time and number of procedures to import or to export is our approximation for trade openness, for competition in a society. And all these categories are very, closely related to one another and explain a lot. Now let me give an example of a country, right? Let's look on how Peru, who has been fighting quite a lot against corruption, I mean, they have like 3 presidents who are indicted in corruption. One even committed suicide. So it's very impressive when you look on paper. Now, how is Peru doing? Peru has improved, for instance, quite a lot on administrative burden. If you look, you would see that it's in its income group rank, it's raised to the 10th position. And in fact, it is not in the same income category with the regional achievers in Latin America. The regional achievers are Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica, but it is improving. And here is where it should improve a little bit more, but it is catching up. In trade openness, I mean, what is it to modify time to import-export? It's not a lot, okay? But what does it mean if you modify time to import-export? It means that people who are privileged will really have competition, because other people with good ideas and with connections who think what to import, export, and a little bit of capital could compete with them. But I mean, otherwise, it's such a costless solution to fight corruption. Liberalize, try to simplify time to this time. Okay, here they are still behind. They are number 20 out of 28 in their income group, right? And if you look at the other countries, at Costa Rica, for instance, Costa Rica is doing better. Chile and Uruguay are already richer than Peru, so they're not in the same income group than this. Finally, in terms of budget transparency, they made a really big effort, and they're now number 2 out of 28 in their income group risk. So, in other words, they showed their expenditures. Now, why is the progress still limited? Well, the progress is still limited, unfortunately, due to the widespread informality. So in Peru, even if they show everything they have, what they have is reduced to like 30%, right? So the formal economy is very small compared to the informal economy. Nevertheless, this is a good way to go. This is a start. And in this analysis, what can be considered in Peru to create resources for corruption are, besides the widespread informality that I already mentioned, well, they have the highest percentage for procurement in all Latin America. So despite the fact that they don't collect much tax, despite the fact that they don't have so important revenues, I mean, they have some energy revenues and other revenues, they have mines, nevertheless, they spend a lot. They put quite a lot of money, they buy a lot. And this is a resource for corruption. So we find that countries which buy a lot from developing countries, in fact, provide more opportunities for corruption, because there's a lot of room for favoritism. Finally, they have a very complicated governance structures with various levels, and that contributes complication, and that contributes poor regulatory quality. So, of course, they would have to address all this. Now, when we look at, how these factors act in time, we find indeed that we find an additional factor, which is not an additional factor, but is another way of measuring transparency, which is something that the UN measured. It's called Open Service Index. And we find that in the past 10 years, countries which improved in this Open Service Index, in the e-services offered by government, things that you can get digitally from the government, have improved a little bit in control of corruption. Why do I say a little bit? Is that because it's not much improvement in control of corruption for the past 10 years. But nevertheless, we found a significant relation between improving in e-government services, in other words, improvement in transparency and in access, right? In reduction in power discretion. Because the more a service is offered, like paying taxes digitally, the less you can encounter someone who will arbitrarily ask you for a bribe or will coerce you or will say, you don't need to pay the whole 100 pesos, just pay 50 and give me, 20 and you're fine. You're off with 70, and this is how the government loses a lot of money. So how to stop these vicious circles going on and create virtuous circles? The grand categories for opportunities for corruption is that you have to reduce administrative burden. This is how you have to think. Successful countries for the past 30 years, that I'll come to in a second, this is what they have done. They reduce this big administrative burden by simplifying legislation in many ways and by simplifying administration. The simpler it is, the less opportunities for corruption exist. And of course, you know the mega example, this is one-stop service halls from Georgia. I'll mention this in a second. The second important area are reforms in the area of fiscal transparency and open contracting. Well, you know, if you are a poor country, you have to build some things. You cannot just say, okay, procurement is a big resource for corruption. I won't procure anything. Well, you know, you can't. You have to build schools, you have to build highways, you have to build an airport, okay? But as you have to build them, as you cannot control this resource for corruption, let's say you receive a lot of aid. You don't want to give this aid back. You want to receive it, but in the same time, in the last 20 years, if you look around, you see that the aid that you received had only empowered the kleptocrats, right? And you don't want that. So the more aid you receive, the more transparency you have to have. You have to have completely transparent aid and aid tied to clear performance and to destination so that you see in every moment where this money goes and what it does. 3, you have to open to competition. You have to open to competition. That means that all these legal barriers, the legal rents have to be removed. The special concessions to people, right? Laws which say only people with violet eyes can have this mining concession, right? In my life, I blacklisted a lot of politicians, and I monitored regularly, for instance, the new ministers in government. And once I encountered a piece of legislation which said something like this: companies in the area of environment, it was companies which use a deoxyhydro-beta regulator are entitled to subventions of up to 10 million euros. And I said, what the hell is a deoxyhydro-beta, whatever that was, right? And we checked, and there was only one company in my country who had that, and it was the company of the Environment Ministry. So in other words, he had passed this piece of legislation for himself. So you don't want any special legislation of this kind, all right? So before thinking what laws against corruption to adopt, you have to think what laws you have to remove or what laws you have to prevent to come into being, because legal corruption in countries where corruption is systematic involves far more money than illegal corruption. Finally, you have to reduce informality. Reducing informality is, of course, a long-term business, but now there is experience on this. There is experience, and of course, e-government helps quite a lot. So what you need to have are digital registers for land, for business. You have to have private personal tax, and I'll come to this in a second, right? Now, the champion of the world in administrative simplification is Estonia. Estonia is a tiny Baltic country in Europe. It only has 1.5 million inhabitants, and it had done this all in the 90s. So in less than 8 years, they have succeeded in creating a good control of corruption. After starting from the Soviet Union, to which they had been a part, corruption in the Soviet Union was absolutely systematic, right? There was a culture of scarcity, and therefore everybody had to bribe to get even the most elementary things that people needed in life. So from systematic corruption to an excellent control of corruption, Estonia this year in the Index of Public Integrity is doing better than Germany and France. This is quite a performance. And it is the shortest performance in the world. So it is the shortest transition to good governance on record. And this is why we recommend to everybody to study this country and what this country has done, because it is quite a glorious example. On our website, you will find a lot of articles about Estonia and process tracing on Estonia in detail, written by Estonian authors working with us. Now, when you look a little bit to see what Estonia has done, you will see that, Estonia is not over-regulating. In other words, in political funding, for instance, they are below the European average. In financial disclosure, however, they are above. In freedom of information, again, they are above. They are below on conflict of interest, and they are below in public procurement. In other words, Estonia has been taking the Finland model. If you remember, I showed you Finland last time. So the important thing that they have done is transparency. They didn't overregulate none of the accountability areas, but they have a lot of transparency. You can read the statements of wealth of any politicians, of assets in big detail. They're up there, posted, right? And you basically find in the public domain anything. Why? Because they are the most advanced e-government country in the world, and they are also, you know, the first, for instance, to have put the land register to use blockchain technology. And that's the way to go. That's the way to go. The second country which has done gloriously in the past 30 years is Georgia. Georgia, in fact, emulated Estonia. They're not different examples. They are very similar as example. But of course, they brought new things of their own. I mean, of course, you know, a previous Georgian government under President Saakashvili. And the important thing that they have done, for instance, is this kind of one-stop administrative building, which is downtown in their capital. It's completely made out of glass. Even if you go around it, you can see what everybody in all the offices do. So it is transparent also in a very material sense as well as in immaterial sense. And the important innovation is this, is that people no longer go when they need something to 5 different government offices. They only go to one. That is the concept of one stop. And then that specific entrance office will contact the other government offices, and all the paper which needs to go around, right? And the less paper and the more emails, the better it is, will be done by government. The citizen will return to the same first entrance and will receive all his stamps, all his approvals, or maybe denials, whatever they are, in only one place, which completely reduces any sort of opportunities for corruption. And in the same time, it enables the government a lot, because a government where various departments communicate is actually a far more effective government than a government which says, you know, you go across the road or you go in another city for this paper, because I have actually no idea what is in this paper. And not only I don't know what's in your paper, but in fact my whole department has no idea what the department does if a majority of people have land or don't have land or whatever. So one-stop administrative shops that can be started without much electronic means, so it is actually not as expensive as that. Of course, it puts a big burden on civil servants from the government. So if you don't pay them at all, it is really, really very difficult to implement. Now, of course, e-government helps, and helps a lot. And in order to achieve the good effects of transparency, what you have to do is not just have a freedom of information law. Freedom of information laws are just the beginning. You know, it's just like saying that, okay, you are now 18, you have the right to marry. Okay, but it's not enough that you have the right to marry. You have to have a choice, right? You have to like someone. And same here. The same here. What we need is to have in the transparent domain all the information that one needs to defend oneself from abuse and to control the government. And this includes quite a lot of what we call digital commons. Things which exist in countries which control corruption well, in most of them, but do not exist elsewhere. For instance, you have to have digital public contracts, a public procurement portal where you publish in open format literally anything about a contract, from the moment when you actually put out an announcement for a tender until the moment when the contract is actually fulfilled. We need to see the interval on time, we need to see the costs, we need to see the overcosts if they existed, and the rest, right? You have to have a digital land cadastre. You have to have a digital land cadastre with real owners, not with, you know, offshore companies. But first, you really have to have it, you know, with any owners, and it has to be there and public so that people can consult it without money. You have to have a register of companies which is digital and which you can access without costs. In this register, you should be able to see the shareholders of a company, you should be able to see if they had profit last year, you should be able to see the turnover of this company, right? That's not private information. This is public information. It's the only way to control and protect against cheating by the other companies. There's no other way. And you have a number of other things like this. We have to have digital licenses and permits. You know, city halls should publish all the concessions, the licenses, and the permits that they award. You should look there and you should see if your neighbor, who by now has reached, you know, the 5th floor in his new construction, actually has a permit. You shouldn't call, you shouldn't go, you should just see out there, you know, uploaded the moment when he receives the approval for some construction. The construction should be uploaded on the City Hall website. And that's more or less with everything else, of course. I mean, and you have to see the assets of politicians and of officials, of elected and of public officials. But there are countries where, you know, a legitimate argument will be made that they cannot publish this because they will be kidnapped and things like this, and I understand this argument. Now, the thing is, if you have all the other things, if you manage to have the land, the public procurement, the companies register, and all the concessions public, you know what, that's fine, and all the subsidies that the government gives, you know, because you have public expenditure, yeah, that's okay, you know, that's okay if you don't post the fortunes of the politicians and you just have to ask for them and you will receive them in your in a personal mail. That would be fine, you know, but it's very difficult to get the rest. Now, who are the achievers in fiscal transparency? In fiscal transparency, achievers are Finland, Norway, New Zealand, and South Africa. What you see here is South Africa. South Africa doesn't do well in many other things, but doing better, of course, than many of their neighbors, but they have invested in, as part of their anti-corruption, in this fiscal transparency, which is a very good thing, okay? What we have in Europe, due to advanced e-government, is that we have in countries which encounter problems with corruption, we have this online tracking expenditure system, which is a software which allows basically every invoice, since all invoices are electronic these days anyway, you know, the accounting is done through a computer, which means that you can have an electronic invoice. It's enough, you know, to take a picture with your phone of an invoice and you can put it in a computer. And the online expenditure system simply aggregate them by units, and therefore you can see and compare expenses across schools, expenses across hospitals, right? And it's an absolutely fabulous tool to see how the administration works for everyone, for patients, for parents of children in hospital. Not many countries do it. It is, you know, perhaps technologically a bit demanding, but seeing that, in fact, as I showed you, e-services and digitalization of government is one of the few things which has really progressed in the last 10 years. Everywhere, online expenditure tracking systems are actually possible. And if you cannot do it for the whole country, you can definitely do an online expenditure tracking system, for instance, for money from aid. Why not? Or for a special development fund, which is very concerning that money in the past, you know, we had to do these surveys called public expenditure tracking surveys, which World Bank was doing, and where in fact you had to travel physically to a school to see if money from the education budget, from the Ministry of Education budget, had managed to drill down to the school or was lost in between. Well, that was 30 years ago. Now we no longer need to do this. Now we can all have it out there digitally and see the day when the money actually travels first to the county, then to the city, and then to the individual school budget. And this is what we should aspire to. Well, there are a number of attempts that you are probably familiar with out there who try to do this. There is this extractive industry transparency initiative, and then there is this revenue watch initiative, which try to look at expenditures from mineral resources to fight what I started with discussing today, to fight the mineral resource curse. They are very limited. In other words, very few countries publish sufficient expenditures out of this mineral resources. The fourth strategy of tackling opportunities of corruption is reducing basically legal rent-seeking by improving regulatory quality. I do not think that this is part of any anti-corruption strategy globally. However, this is the most important thing. This is how Estonia and Georgia have done it. And this is why, I mean, again, we have to learn from countries which succeeded rather than, you know, put up code books from, you know, writing the most perfect criminal code, but who's going to implement the most perfect criminal code, right? and whom to arrest when 80% of the country are doing the wrong thing. So it's quite important to change the rule, right? Before punishing a few people, let's try to change how the majority behaves. And again, best example in the world is Estonia. The second best example is actually South Korea, and South Korea's success is very impressive because South Korea also started from entrenched rent seeking and from systematic corruption, and it did not get rid of all of it. But if you looked how South Korea performed during these epidemics, for instance, you would see that there is really an effective government. A government which traveled quite a lot of way, and a government which has the trust of the society. Their society accepted, for instance, the corona apps very easily because they trust this government. They know that this government is doing fairly well. And this is a trust which was earned for, quite some years. Now, what are, there are no simple tricks on how to improve regulatory quality. In Italy, for instance, they've done a committee to simply cut legislation. During Prime Minister Mario Monti, they cut like 60,000 laws. And in the end, people said that it was absolutely insufficient because it was so stuffy, so overregulated, so just meant to, address problems and create barriers that far, far too many resisted. Which resisted? Well, the regulation which resisted is the regulation which is defended by some status group, by some group which has a legal privilege and doesn't allow this legislation to change. This was the same in Greece. Greece didn't have like a small kleptocracy, some people on the top who stole Greece. That was not Greece's problem. The problem was various groups, strong groups with historical entitlements, their profit versus the benefit of the whole society. They really bankrupted this country because no group wanted to cut from themselves, and all this group prevented the change of legislation. When European Union worked on Greece on how to reduce reform, they also created some governance conditionalities, and one of this was asking Greece to liberalize access in professions. In other words, there were very few people in Greece who had the right to be taxi drivers, and they allowed not only other people to be taxi drivers, but they didn't allow, for instance, a company which would drive people with a chauffeur. This was not allowed, right? It was a limited number of hairdressers who did not allow other people to enter the hairdress profession. They would all have to agree. And there were like over 100 professions like this, including engineers and other things. And that is the problem in many, many corrupt countries. It's not just one head that you should cut and then the whole country will be well. I mean, maybe there are situations like this and there you need a revolution, all right? But there are not many, in fact. What happens is that even for these top kleptocrats, even for autocrats to survive in power, what they do is that they buy this group, and then those groups become very strong and defend their entitlements. So in order to build good control of corruption, you have to liberalize. You have to eliminate these group privileges. And in recent years, Ukraine, for instance, has done a quite good job. They used to be a country with a lot of favoritism in energy, which was absolutely shameless for them because they were a post-Soviet country, so they were next to Russia, so it was a matter of security for them. And the way it worked is that some privileged individuals, people with good ties with government, both in Ukraine and in Russia, they used to buy very cheap gas from a government and sell to another part of the state sector very expensively. And only very few people had the privilege of doing this, this kind of smart people, in brackets. Very few. So the government simply decided that these people are going to be allowed to do this and generate a lot of money. And then, of course, this lot of money was going to people in government who gave them the license to do this, and therefore. And in recent years, they finally liberalized it. And you can see this immediately. You can see that instead of a very few number of operators, now you have a bigger number of operators in energy. And that's a good side. It means that competition is increasing. Now, privatization is the most contested way of improving regulatory quality and of reducing legal privileges. Why? Because it is not so much the form of property which creates corruption, although, states are notoriously poor organizers of services. But nevertheless, states can also be, in developed Europe, states can very, very well organize services in an uncorrupt and very efficient way. So it is not that the state in itself cannot be a good operator. The problem is that quite a lot of utilities, for instance, they are de facto monopolies. And therefore, even if you privatize them, like water for Veolia or electricity for Enel, you have quite a lot of corruption scandals. And the reason you have corruption scandals is that they have absolutely no kind of accountability structure and they remain monopolies. All right, so you have to have other solutions here, and I will talk more about the solutions next time, because these are solutions on the side of constraints. This is simply organizing some sort of social accountability so that consumers, the customers of these utilities, are in the position to fight back, to monitor and control the way government works. Reducing informal economy. I already started to speak about this. Crackdowns do not work. The best example is in fact Uruguay. I mean, yes, of course you have to crack down on certain things, you know, you have to crack down on drug lords, all right? But even on drug lords, the most effective solution is not a crackdown, but it's in drying out their market, all right? So some liberalization of drugs, you know, historically, or of other product like this was the best way to kill a traffic, not going trafficker by trafficker, because if it is a very, very big market for this, you know, you arrest some people and other people will come and supply the market. So yes, against the black economy, you really have to do some repression. But I'm not speaking about the black economy now, because it's not 70% in Peru are not, you know, employed in drugs. They are employed in everything else, right? 70% informal unemployment means quite a lot, and means gray economy, right? And the gray economy you do not repress. You try to create incentives to attract it. And some good example on top of Uruguay that I already mentioned, for instance, some countries, for instance, tried to eliminate this surplus cash flow by eliminating a number of, by simply eliminating money, saying, you know, that 1,000 banknotes should be eliminated from circulation. By now, there are quite a number of countries who have done this. For some of them, worked better than for the others. But overall, there is no big success related to this. So we really do not want to, you know, to burn money, to tell people, you know, that the money that you have is no longer valuable. That's not the solution. You want them to give this money to you so that you put it into social security, pensions, and the rest. Very good example presently are India's smart electronic policy, electronic IDs, and the electronic IDs, you can do a number of things with them. And in particular, the most attractive thing is that you get also a bank account and you can have secure bank connections. And this way, everything becomes transparent. There are no costs for you. You don't need to go to the bank. You can do it all with your smartphone. So with your ID, if you accept to have this ID, of course, ID is a bit incentive because it's one of this ID which uses, you know, your eyesight and the rest. If you accept this, then it really opens access to you, to a variety of resources. So the steps are incentives for people to register, incentives for people to come into the open, then more incentives for people to participate, to do things, right? And this will lead to an increase in accountable money, in accountable citizens, and in accountable businesses. You can see Uruguay on the index for public economy. I'm not going to spend too much on it here. Uruguay really does very, very well on all these chapters. Now, of course, there are countries which have increased transparency in the past 10 years. And always Ukraine is a case in point, because people will say, well, Ukraine had increased transparency. Now it has the best public procurement portal in the world, right? The Prozoro. And corruption doesn't seem to have gone down in Ukraine. And indeed it has not. If you look here, what you see here is basically indicator of non-competitive tenders, which generally means corrupt tenders, because why would people not compete in tenders? People don't compete in tenders either because that other people will win, they know that others, you know, it's a fixed tender, or because the terms of reference are written by one participant, or because criteria, you know, exclude somebody. And if you see here, you see from 2016 to 2019 that across Ukrainian regions, roughly non-competitive tenders remain the rule. 2/3 of the regions have non-competitive tenders, and this has not changed. This has not changed despite the fact that now it's a very transparent system. All this is out there and everyone can see. You know, we've done this simply by computing this data out from their open public portal, right? So the question is, why did not transparency work for Ukraine? Let me explain. What happens, a discussion that I heard in Ukraine is, why aren't these people arrested? Well, it's a very simple reason for this. You know, if you look in some regions, it's really, really very high. They're not arrested because they are 2/3 of procurement committees in Ukraine. In fact, they're all, right? Because it's the same procurement committee which gives 2 out of 3 tenders under this non-competitive committees. So you cannot arrest everybody. You cannot arrest all the companies and you cannot arrest all these people. What do you need to do is, in fact, to have an administrative solution. And this administrative solution, the only cost-effective solution to do is to have a procurement policy where, in fact, you create the administrative benchmarks for procurement. You can, for instance, use the criteria of the European Union, which are quite good. They are posted on single market procurement scoreboard, which says good procurement is procurement which is transparent, which is competitive, and which has quite a lot small and medium enterprises, because you want to have market diversity. You do not want to have market concentration, monopolies, or oligopolies, right? And how can you implement that? Well, you can create incentives for people to run procurement boards, all kinds of incentives, positives and negatives. You can say, okay, either you implement my policy and I'm going to have not 70% non-competitive tenders, but 70% competitive tenders. And this is how market concentration should look like. And this is how costs should look like in this field or in this other field, right? And you can tie this with pure public management tools like flexible shares of salaries, like contracts which are just limited contracts. You're not going to have a management contract of this company, of this public company or of this public authority unless you manage to implement the procurement that I want, a clean government. Okay, the question of course here comes is, can you do any of this? Can you do any of this in the absence of political will, right? So you can see you have done the Prozoro. Prozoro was related to Ukraine. So it was tied with conditions for Ukraine money. Ukraine needed money from abroad because it had this war, right? But what if the government doesn't want to do this? What if government doesn't want to implement the kind of open, transparent, cost-effective, right, procurement policy? Now, and this is a very frequent situation. Now, what can you do? Well, you can build digital commons by private sector. I've met this in some countries, commerce registers built entirely by private sector, and they still play a very useful role against fraud and corruption. What you can also do is that you can do a lot of naming and shaming for transparency, right? I have seen naming and shaming done for various government agencies, which is playing quite effectively. Make it costly for them that they are opaque. Periodically publish wherever you can publish tops of government and their lack of transparency and the things that they have to hide. You know, in Chile I found something quite very nice. Some IT Facebook group were simply rating various government agencies by the CAPTCHAs, by the way that they paroled the government websites so that people don't have open access, right? Very nice. And they published this, and then the government had to give in, and because they had no reason to say why they hide this data, right? Maybe you don't have a reformer government on the top, but you may have cities. We may have cities where you have stronger civil society and more reform-minded mayors. Well, they can pioneer some of these tools, even if they don't exist in the rest of the countries. And of course, donors should support mayors in such cities, right? The other important thing that you can always do, you can do a plan how to cut resources. A bad guy is in government, you have a bad government and you're in opposition. But in my life, I have seen that frequently good guys, people like us, when we win government, we have no clue what to do. This regulatory redress that I presented to you today is very complicated. The Prime Minister of Estonia, whom I interviewed, the man who did all the miracle in the 90s, always said, oh, it's very easy to arrest people, right? But to fix core regulation is very complicated. And what I liked about Uruguay is that they did it all when they were in opposition. During the coup d'etat, when generals were running the country, the liberal-minded civilians were sort of creating think tanks and thinking, okay, presuming we get to government again, how should this country be organized? What kind of laws should we have so the civilians do not applaud for a second time when a coup d'etat happens and said, oh good, it's good to have these corrupt civilians out of there. So opposition time should be invested. This is not a lot of time. Don't lose your time asking the government to change this and this legislation if this is really a corrupt government, because they're not going to implement it anyway, right? Instead, try to win elections and try to be very well prepared when you win elections. Come with your laws written to government. Come with your 60 laws that you're going to cut and the kind of things that you're going to do. That is quite important. Well, the other thing that you can do in a limited situation, presuming that government doesn't have high political will, but the judiciary works, okay? This was my case, for instance. The judiciary worked in my country, although governments were all corrupt on one another and with zero political will. So I went to court. I litigated administratively a lot, quite a lot, on a number of issues, through freedom of information, but also other things. And courts helped us, not from the start, they learned, but with a lot of learning from the courts, in the end, we did a lot. So, more or less, this is what you can do in terms of political resources. I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today.